Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this event. My name is Valdete Berisha, and I'm a Senior External Affairs Officer at SIGAP, where, among other things, I also lead FinDev Gateway. As many of you know, FinDev Gateway is SIGAP's knowledge-sharing platform for the financial inclusion community. We also have our 3 regional platforms that are in Arabic, French, and Spanish. So for those of you who have already used FinDev are well familiar with those as well. Before I introduce our guests today, I'd like to make a couple of quick notes on just how this event will flow. First of all, as you may already have seen, this event is being recorded, so we will make the recording available on our website on findevgateway.org, and we will also share the recording link with everyone who has registered for this webinar. Second, we will try to keep this conversation as interactive as possible. Obviously, I've prepared some questions for our guests, but I also invite everyone to join through the chat box, ask questions and comment so that we can keep the conversation lively. I will try to incorporate as many of your comments and questions into the conversation as possible. So now it's my pleasure to welcome our guests, Alex Counts and Scott McMillan. Alex, as many of you know, is the founder of Grameen Foundation, which he established in 1997 with the help of Nobel laureate Dr. Mohamed Yunus. He has over 20 years of experience in microfinance and poverty reduction. 10 of those years he spent living in rural Bangladesh. Alex is also the author of Small Loans, Big Dreams, which is one of the books we're going to discuss today, which tells the story of Grameen Bank, its founder Mohamed Yunus, and follows the journeys of microfinance borrowers in Bangladesh and in the US. With us is also Scott McMillan, Director of Learning and Innovation at BRAC USA, where he has been since 2011. Scott is a former journalist, and he was also a speechwriter for Fazl Abed, the founder of BRAC. Scott is also the author of Hope Over Fate, Fazl Hassan Abed and the Science of Ending Global Poverty, which is one of the other books we're going to discuss today as well, and in which Scott tells the story of BRAC, its founder, Fazl Abed, and the dedication of BRAC's staff to the organization's mission. So, excuse me, before we dive into the conversation, I think I just wanted to share with you what I got, one of the main takeaways that I got from these 2 books. And I think for me, they tell the story of 2 organizations, homegrown in Bangladesh, which inspired anti-poverty efforts around the world. They both started as small pilot projects and managed to scale up to reach millions of people. Grameen Bank now employs nearly 18,000 employees, and in 2002, it was providing services to about 9.3 million people. On the other hand, BRAC is considered the largest NGO in the world. As of 2019, it had close to 100 staff members spread across 4 continents, with 8,000 of them outside of Bangladesh. So today, BRAC reaches over 100,000 people through their wide range of services they provide in education, health, agriculture, financial inclusion, and much more. So before we dive into the conversation, I think it's worth mentioning the context in which these 2 organizations emerged. They both have their origins in the 1970s. Back then, Bangladesh faced immense challenges. It ranked as the 2nd poorest country in the world after what is known now Burkina Faso. Child mortality rate was high, and the country constantly faced challenges of flooding. Today, on the other hand, Bangladesh ranks among lower middle income countries and is seen widely as an economic transformation example. Poverty rates have dropped from 11.8% in 2010 to just 5% in 2022. And improvements in health and education and other aspects of human development indicators have all been remarkable. So obviously, there are many factors that have contributed to this transformation. But in the words of Kaushik Basu, the former chief economist of the World Bank, he said that Bangladesh's economic transformation was driven in large part by social changes, starting with the empowerment of women. And obviously, BRAC and Grameen did a huge amount of work in these areas in Bangladesh in the last 5 decades. So I'm going to start with a question for Alex. Alex, in your book, you detail the experiences of women borrowers in Bangladesh and Chicago, where there were early efforts to adapt Grameen model in the U.S. context. Could you please speak about what kind of insights we can draw from these women's stories in terms of their contribution, the contribution that microfinance and especially Grameen model microfinance made to anti-poverty efforts?
Sure. I want to thank the Gateway and CGAP for hosting this, and I hope those of you who've tuned in, I'm really glad you have, that you consider buying and reading and reviewing these books and circulating them to people that you influence. But I also want to say that I've always admired BRAC. My wife worked there for 2 years when we lived in Bangladesh. I saw BRAC and Grameen collaborate at the field level. I talk about that in my book, The Village that I intensively studied. I had my own warm relationship with Abed, and Scott's book is fantastic. So, but with regard to Grameen's contributions over 47 years, lending $37 billion, that's billion with a B, and recovering virtually every taka. I think you just look at the micro and macro levels. Starting in the late 80s and early 90s, I studied intensively 3 areas of Bangladesh, and one of which was the main focus of my book, the Bangladesh portion of my book. And then I went back there every few years, ever since. And I saw undeniable and obvious progress, and I saw the undeniable and obvious contribution of Grameen, which almost everyone in those communities would confirm if you asked them, and I did. So interestingly, Tim Ogden at NYU, who I sometimes strongly agree with, sometimes strongly disagree with, he wrote a great paper that I loved. But one thing he said in passing, he said that microfinance impact, the story about it, does not meet the eyeball test. Now, I don't know how many months and years he spent in rural areas of Bangladesh, but I spent quite a bit, and I don't agree with that. And I want to say 3 things very briefly. One is, if you just parachute into a community, look at it, and then 18 months later go back after microfinance is introduced, you're going to miss a lot of change because you're not going to pick it up, and some of it hasn't happened yet. And then also, when I was studying intensively this one community in particular, I was discovering new things about Grameen's impact and what was actually going on there. Like in my 24th conversation with a family, in fact, sometimes it was the opposite of what I thought going into that conversation. So I wonder how much is missed by kind of drive-by research that happens in microfinance. And so yes, I do find that the impact, at least with respect to Grameen, it does pass the eyeball test if you look at it the right way. Now, at the macro level, I'll just simply say this. I, for one, do not think it's a coincidence that the countries where microfinance has been practiced most consistently, widely, and effectively have also achieved the largest poverty reductions. Sometimes think about Bangladesh, think about India, think about Indonesia, think about Peru. The numbers, Valdete, that you cited from 2010 in Bangladesh go back to 1975 poverty figures. Compare that to 2022. And so, again, I don't think that this correlation is a coincidence. I hope some researcher picks it up. I'm shocked that no one has so far, but I see a very significant impact of Grameen and organizations that operate in a spirit of Grameen with the same intentions and rigor of Grameen, like BRAC and others. You're muted.
So
Valdete.
Valdete, you're muted.
Sorry, I muted so that I don't make any background noise. Thank you for that, Alex. I think that story about impact is really. I wanted to go to Scott because Scott's book portrays Fazal Abed's views about poverty and anti-poverty efforts, and I think one of Abed's beliefs was that poverty is multifaceted, and as such, it requires a wide range of solutions. So I think this vision was rooted in what Scott describes as hope over fate. And I was wondering if, Scott, you can talk a little bit about this concept. What does it mean to have hope over fate? And how does this concept contribute to anti-poverty?
Huge thank you, first of all, to, well, a number of Gateway and CGAP for hosting this conversation. Alex, you yourself for initiating the conversation that sort of put this in motion, and for your my effusive thanks to you for your praise of the book and of Abed and BRAC. I'm equally equal admiration for the contributions of Eunice and Grameen. I began my book in the spirit of a man like Abed, the founder of BRAC, who really did not like to tell stories, and especially not stories about himself. I begin the book with an anecdote, not about Abed, although it's a biography, but about a woman living in the far north of Bangladesh named Shohida. And it's a kind of a tragic comic story. I'm not going to tell it right now, but the name of the chapter is "The Fox That Killed My Goats." And she participated in one of BRAC's ultra poor graduation programs. She was actually one of the first participants in that program, which I'm sure a lot of participants might have heard of somewhere along the way. And she tells this story about how BRAC gave her some goats, and the goats multiplied as goats do. And then the fox came to town and killed one of her goats, and it was as though her own child had been murdered. She had been so attached to these goats, despite the fact that she was planning to sell them for meat. She was so attached to them that she said, "I don't know where the tears came from." And she was so distraught. And it occurred to me, I am talking to this woman, 10 years after good 15 years actually after that event took place. And she's such a confident woman, the way that she walks, the way that she talks, just exudes confidence. And yet then she's talking about herself in this state of destitution, on the verge of starvation, talking about how she was in tears over this one goat that died. And I began to sort of ask myself, like, where does this confidence really come from? A lot of people might say, well, the changes in her life have been quite remarkable. She now has a lot of assets. She has several acres of land. And so, of course, she's more confident because she lifted herself out of poverty. But if you look at the research, a lot of research, I'm thinking about some of the work of Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, but many others as well. A lot of the research suggests that the causality actually goes in the opposite direction. In other words, she rose from poverty because of her confidence. And it was something about the program that she was a part of that didn't just give her goats, but also gave her confidence. In short, the program that she was part of instilled hope. And it was this hope that made her realize it was not her fate to be poor. And that in and of itself made a difference. It didn't make the only difference, right? She needed the goats. She needed access to health care. She needed agricultural training and all sorts of other inputs. But none of that would really mean a thing if she didn't first believe in herself and believe in the possibility of change. And that overcoming that fatalism, if you will, was the key to really breaking the poverty trap for herself and millions more like her. So that's sort of that's why I said that the story of BRAC is in many ways the triumph of hope over fate, and that's kind of the message that I'm trying to convey in this book. So I'll stop right there. I think there's a lot more to be said about it, a lot more proof points, and a lot of nuances, because it is a nuanced distinction, right? Poverty, getting people out of poverty, is not just a pep talk; it's much more than that. But if you don't address the underlying despair that people often feel, they are very, very, very likely to slide back. So that's, I think, one thing that sets BRAC apart.
That's great. That's really a fascinating story, and I enjoyed reading that story in the book. And certainly there's others who have done a lot of research on aspirations and the role of aspirations in getting in development. So
that woman was one of the funniest people that I met in researching my book. Just her sense of humor and the way she talks about, she recently had electricity installed in her home, and she talks about how she was so afraid to touch the wire, and she would stand back like 5 feet while she flipped the light switch. Just a hilarious woman, and the way she talked about herself and her experience.
Yes.
I try to convey that.
Great, and I was going to say great storytelling skills too, because it is not a book like most books are. When you read about development, it has that human element, and I think both of these books have that in common, that bring that human element in them. But I wanted to just go back quickly to the organizations themselves, because I think what I really took away from reading these two books is also the fact that these are two development organizations that came from a low-income country, and really emerged in very difficult contexts, and reached a huge scale and global prominence, and in a way inspired a lot of efforts later on in different countries. So I was hoping we can talk a little bit about what made them so successful. Beyond the obviously, the leadership, the visionary leaders who were, very committed and driven, and had the power to mobilize resources and people. What were some other ways that we can explain the success of these two organizations?
Alex, do you want to go first?
Sure. First of all, I think, BRAC and Grameen really changed. I think it's important to say that BRAC and Grameen really changed the dynamics of aid going back, especially to the 1980s. They put themselves in the driver's seat. They said to the aid organizations in the country, we're not going to implement your projects. If you want to help us build institutions, come and help us. But if not, just do your projects. But that's not what we're going to do. And that put them in the driver's seat. They made mistakes along the way, but they learned from them. That's what organizations do when they're well run. And I think we need to look at Bangladesh had some disadvantages as a country, but also some real advantages: population density, fertile land, a single language, not necessarily a good government, but at least a permissive government most of the time. So what led to Grameen success? Well, I'll also say, by the way, in my time in rural Bangladesh, I learned more about goats than I thought I'd ever learn. And so maybe that's the recurring theme of this webinar. But also, I want to say that this idea of going from despair to hope, it operates at the personal and the family level, but it also operates at the community and national level. If you look at the self-confidence of Bangladesh and Bangladeshis in the 70s and 80s compared to now, it's wildly different. And I think that BRAC and Grameen and civil society organizations that have instilled pride in the country have had a lot to do with that. But Grameen's success, very briefly, first of all, they knew what to centralize and what to decentralize in running a massive, complex organization. Grameen managers at the field level have a lot of authority to make decisions. I talk about that in my book. Grameen never confused means and ends. You know, financial performance of Grameen was always a means to make sure that it could go for the long term, but the ends was always eliminating poverty one family at a time. And they developed very simple practical indicators to do that. And they also invited researchers in to study them. I mean, teams and teams of researchers over decades. It helped keep the staff focused on the right things. Third, Grameen developed a kind of a series of world-class sister organizations that, while they were legally and financially and operationally separate from Grameen Bank, they operated in coordination. I mean, Grameen Shakti, Grameen Eye Hospital, Nursing College, Grameen Danone. These are world-class institutions on their own, and yet they worked in collaboration with Grameen Bank. And lastly, Grameen did a great job, not perfect, of cultivating talent through merit-based promotions, professional development, and instilling a culture of pride. That when Professor Yunus was unexpectedly removed from his role at Grameen, people stepped in and ran it effectively. I think some of these may be common with BRAC, but certainly this is my view of Grameen.
I would not add. I don't think I can add much more to that because so much of that applies to BRAC as well. I would say that there's a certain stick-to-itness, doggedness, but also, especially for Abed, a complete and utter lack of dogmatism. Right? He was never married to any one approach or any one solution. He often, the only thing that he was really married to really was the imperative, the only concept he was focused on. I would say, this idea of instilling hope in people being important, but also the necessity for scale, right? He didn't want to just be tinkering around on the edges, and if it wasn't scalable, it really wasn't worth doing in Abed's perspective. The lack of dogmatism manifested itself in an ability to stop doing things that don't work. You'd be surprised at how many organizations just continue to do things that obviously don't work, thinking that one of these days we're going to get it right. And for Abed, he would say, nope, that didn't work for whatever reason. We're going to move on. Now, there were certain problems that absolutely had to be solved. I'm thinking about the child survival program in the 1980s, which reached 13 million mothers with the distribution of teaching mothers to make their own oral saline solution. That was something that had to be solved, and it had to be solved approaching the problem from many different ways. He wasn't going to give up on that, but also an ability to simplify where needed. It's not that hard to make things complicated. You just add more and more stuff. It's making things simple and replicable that is the really, really difficult thing about going to scale. So I'll stop right there.
Great, thank you both. I also too got the commitment to playing the long game, as Alex puts it in his book, which is also reflected in your book, Scott, in the chapter Visions and Revisions. I think the ability to test different approaches and to fight poverty, and when they fail, test again, and do that over a span of several decades, and which is not really typical for a lot of development projects, which usually have a life cycle of 3 to 5 years. So I think that's really a great feature of these two organizations, I think. So moving to another aspect of this conversation, which is, both Grameen and BRAC obviously had remarkable journeys, but no organization is without challenges. So I wanted to take just a few minutes to talk about what were some of the major things that these two organizations struggled with, and how were they able to overcome them. And maybe this will also tell us a bit of the story of how the models evolved over time, or how the thinking evolved over time based on those struggles. So going over to you, Alex, if you can share some challenges that Grameen faced and how
Yeah.
it addressed them.
Grameen never faced any challenges. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I think there are a couple that come up. You know, one is natural disasters. Bangladesh is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world. That's only going to get worse with climate change. And you know, whether it's the floods of 1980, the floods of 1988, the cyclone of 91, you name it. You know, some of these really endangered an organization that chose to go to some of the most remote and vulnerable areas as a matter of principle. But and over time, Grameen had to develop, if it was going to survive, a way to deal with these disasters, which included putting clients first, rescheduling loans, for which it was criticized by a lot of armchair microfinance experts, but actually was, and then to renew the loans. They required staff, when a natural disaster strikes, in a lot of groups, government, non-government, the staff go to their home districts, and the Grameen staff were expected to go directly to the borrowers and to see what was going on and how they could help. They gave great authority to local leaders, especially before communications became so easy to make decisions. And this all kind of helped the organization deal with that. That's number one. Number two, Grameen developed a methodology, which we now call the Grameen Classic System, that by the late 90s was starting to fall behind its competitors, was starting to show its age and limitations. And then the floods of 1998 really put a dent in Grameen. And so Grameen decided to first of all, Grameen had kind of dismissed its donor consortium by that point. They said they want to just be entirely self-reliant. So they issued some bonds in the local market to kind of buy some time, and then completely reinvented the Grameen methodology to be more savings-led, to be more transparent about poverty impact, less focused on peer pressure, more flexibility in the lending. And it worked. It worked beautifully. And it took a lot of guts. You know, that Scott's point, you know, when you're used to habitually doing something, even if it's not working as well as it used to, there's a strong organizational imperative to continue, because it's a familiarity. People are like this, communities are like this, organizations are like. Grameen reinvented its methodology, particularly at the time it was. Third, I think one of the challenges, Grameen's independence has been challenged throughout its history, and one of the things it did is it decided to constitute its board by ultimately a majority of the board by borrowers who elected from fellow borrowers. It basically, in that way, it's kind of more like a cooperative. That heavily criticized for that, but ultimately the borrowers serving on the board ended up being some of the most articulate spokespeople for maintaining the independence of Grameen. And you can watch YouTube videos with subtitles if you're curious. Rigorous auditing and cost control was obviously what helped. You know, as organizations age, they sometimes get just less rigorous, and that was always an important part. And then also Professor Yunus did a great job, again, also I think underappreciated, of developing a second line of leadership that really blossomed when he moved on to focus on building a social business movement in 2011. And those leaders stepped up and have done a great job, one of whom ran it for about 5 or 6 years as a close personal friend of mine, and others I don't know as well. But that second line of leadership, again, you know, could have been was a major challenge. It needed to, the succession plan needed to be activated very quickly, but it worked.
You know, one of the foundational moments for BRAC and Abed took place back in the early 1970s. And it was the failure of one of the organization's first projects, which was a project for adult literacy. So essentially, you know, Abed went to a very remote area of northern Bangladesh, launched this literacy program where in the evening, after the day's work was done, people would gather and take basic literacy and numeracy classes, which Abed believed was foundational for people's development. Nothing like that had ever been offered in that part of the country before, and the take-up was, you know, 95% of the target population attended on a regular basis in the first few months. About 18 months later, that number was 5%. And the community centers that he had set up were falling into disrepair. Nobody some of them were falling down. It was a complete and utter failure. And I remember Abed said to me, well, who could blame them for not showing up? Who wants to show up, after a long day working in the field, show up to learn to read and write, skills that in their mind would never be of any use to them. And it was that moment that he began experimenting with the methodology of a Brazilian educator by the name of Paulo Freire. And the Freirean methodology was based on dialogue and discussion, and it was really based on, yes, it was a literacy and numeracy program. You learn to read and write, but most importantly, people learn to question their situation, ask questions amongst themselves about how they could work through the challenges that they faced, how they could confront the forces that were keeping them down, the money lenders, the landlords, all these things. Most importantly, it gave people a sense of solidarity and self-worth. It gave people a sense of hope, right? And I try to draw a line. I try to draw the intellectual. It's like an intellectual a biography of an idea, if you will, and this idea of instilling hope in people's lives and what difference that can make, going all the way back to the days of the Freirean education programs in the 1970s to the graduation programs that are so widely replicated today. I think that's sort of the line that's the common thread that weaves itself throughout the BRAC story. I'll stop right there. I think there's another story to be told in the late 1990s when Abed realized that microfinance itself really wasn't reaching the poorest of the poor. And this is kind of what led to the birth of the graduation program. We can talk a little bit more about that later, but yeah, there have been a lot of growing pains and challenges along the way, and Abed was always the first to want to confront that.
Great, thank you. I think that just reminded me that story about empowering people also to stand up for themselves. It also reminded me of a reference that Alex makes in his book about something that Tim Ogden had said, that maybe one of the greatest contributions of microfinance is this idea that it raises the standard for a lot of other organizations in terms of, excuse me, how they should deal with people, because of just the hard work and the honest work of the individuals working for these organizations that were inspired by social entrepreneurs. So I think that kind of ties very well to that story.
Gosh, you really did read the books.
I did. I should. There's a lot of this.
Wow.
So,
okay.
I did pay attention, and I think because I enjoyed them. So, but because we are a little bit over our time, and I don't see a lot of questions yet from the audience, but we have a lot of other questions and things to cover. So, I wanted to just shift now gears to talking more broadly about the microfinance sector. And so I would like to start with you, Alex, because as you know and point out that there's microfinance sector has evolved substantially over time. There's different kinds of models now, and so there's a lot of questions about whether the sector is going to be able to adapt to technology, along with concerns about scale and ethical practices of some players. So given all this, do you believe that microfinance institutions remain a relevant tool in anti-poverty efforts? So if you can talk a little bit about, just what have been some observations.
Sure.
That you might have.
Sure, I'd say Grameen Bank and many other groups I have quietly been using technology effectively for a long time. But again, technology was always the means, not the ends. It was, how do you use technology to aid in the reduction of poverty and running an efficient, transparent institution, as opposed to just using technology to amuse yourself by your cleverness. And I don't think Grameen is alone in this. When ATMs started coming into the U.S. in the 80s, everyone's like, oh, there'll be no more tellers in banks. Well, I was just in a bank yesterday. There's still a lot of tellers. They're just doing higher value added work for customers. And I think that's true for microfinance institutions that use technology well. I think the question about the continued relevance of MFIs is only a question that could be asked in places like Washington or London or Geneva, frankly. I think the closer you get to the communities that benefit from microfinance, which include a lot of growing number of inner cities in the US served by Grameen America, that question kind of appears somewhat ridiculous. Microfinance institutions have survived populist politicians, the so-called fintech revolution that was supposed to make it irrelevant, a pandemic, and much more, and is going strong. It doesn't receive the attention in the media that it used to, but that doesn't mean that it's not thriving in many markets. And I think when you talk about the ethical practices of microfinance, and like any industry, there's a wide range of ethical standards and practices. I think Grameen and BRAC are merit study on those grounds as well. I also think that the SMART campaign developed by the Center for Financial Inclusion, and now known as the Client Protection Gateway, is a very relevant and important standard. The True Lift approach that I helped develop with other leaders, Carmen Velasco and Chris Dunford, is another approach that I think is very powerful. And again, I think the continued relevance of microfinance, even if it's not in the public eye as it once was, when it was a kind of an international development fad for a decade or two, is undeniable.
Yeah, in preparation for this discussion, I remembered this article that The Economist wrote a few years ago. I looked it up. It actually was 2016. So that's 7 years ago now, right? But it was about microfinance and the fact that the so-called development caravan, kind of the wagon train of poverty interventions that get donors really excited, had kind of pulled away from microfinance. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that microfinance had just gone wildly out of fashion in favor of things like, the graduation programs that I mentioned, mobile money. And yet the numbers showed that microfinance was actually booming, right? And you'd kind of be forgiven for if you were to read this article in The Economist, for thinking that the central premise seemed to be that microfinance was kind of not very innovative. It was in the doldrums. It wasn't really making a huge impact on people's lives, and then it needed to be a lot more innovative and flexible. And I remember I wrote a blog response to that. The title is "Whatever Happened to Microfinance?" And sort of pointing out that there's actually a lot of innovation going on with big microfinance providers such as BRAC, such as Grameen, loan products tailored for tenant and smallholder farmers with flexible repayment rates, for instance, medical loans designed for those facing health shocks. BRAC has safe migration loans, for instance, which include wraparound services for migrant workers. All of these, if you look at what One Acre Fund, which recently is being awarded, won the Hilton Humanitarian Prize recently, combines credit with other services like access to seeds and fertilizer, training for farmers, etc. Even the graduation program has evolved such that most of the ultra poor participants were people, deemed too poor to benefit from microfinance. Majority of those participants are actually repaying a portion, and in many cases, the entirety of the value of the assets that are given to them. So this idea that you have sort of ultra poor graduation over here and microfinance over there, and the twain do not meet is completely false. There's actually a continuum of services between them. So it's just the wrong way to think of it. It's graduation programs themselves are a step towards radical financial inclusion, if you will. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. There's a lot going on.
Certainly, and I think the point of the question was really just to put microfinance in the context of what's going on now in terms of competition from other digital providers. The fact that there's a growing amount and access to data that a lot of these digital providers are able to use and tap into, and the idea is that increasingly they're able to tap into these markets or segments where microfinance institutions have always had an advantage because they've held the relationships. And so in that sense, the question, just to what extent are microfinance institutions going to be able to adapt and to, because I think there is something that will be lost if the shift goes completely digital. Part of the strength of microfinance institutions has always been the relationships and their immersion into the communities that they serve. So just how do we maintain that while being competitive and not losing ground and continuing to serve this segment of population that microfinance institutions know the best. But anyway, I think we can move to the next question, which was going to be for Scott. And I think maybe some of it you've already touched, Scott, but as Director of Innovation and Learning at BRAC, I thought maybe you can talk a little bit about what might be some of the some innovations, some specific innovations that hold promise for microfinance.
Yeah, first of all, you'd be forgiven for not knowing this because I failed to mention it, but my new title is actually Director of Learning and Effectiveness. And one of the reasons for BRAC International, which is the entity that oversees all operations outside Bangladesh, and one of the reasons we chose that effectiveness, learning and effectiveness, was the executive director of BRAC International, who was in fact the founder's son, said, my father would have really liked that word. So let's keep that there. Effectiveness is one of the core values of BRAC. So which leads me to answer your question. The future for BRAC, anyway, has a lot to do with working with and through others. And that relates to there's a key quote that's actually in the book, buried on page 200 something. I actually asked Abed, what's the most important thing you've learned, right, in all these decades? And he said, increasingly I realize the importance of good governance. It used to be that I just thought that NGOs could do everything. And I no longer think that. Right. And Alex, you touched upon the sort of context of Bangladesh, where you had a not necessarily effective, but certainly a permissive government that allowed entities such as BRAC and Grameen to not only flourish, but go to scale. The importance of work, that's what led to the idea that, well, maybe we just have to do everything on our own. Increasingly, we do realize that there are a lot of anti-poverty efforts that are already being taken on by governments, but they're often being run in a very haphazard and ineffective fashion. And if we can work with these governments to make their programs more effective, to create lasting and sustainable changes in people's lives, especially for those that are really struggling with poverty, that are on the edge of destitution or in the poverty trap, so to speak. In other words, no matter how hard they work, they'll never be able to get out without a change in the equilibrium. If we can work with governments to give that big push necessary to break people out of the poverty trap, that is the path to true scale, meaning, really make a dent in the first of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the complete eradication of extreme poverty from the face of the earth. I don't think it's going to happen without working with governments. And you're going to be seeing, you already are seeing a lot more of that in terms of BRAC's work than you did, say, 5 or 10 years ago.
And there is actually a question that came in from one of the participants about the role of government regulation in the success or failure of organizations. So I guess it kind of ties into what you were saying, but if you, maybe Alex, if you want to add anything about that.
Sure. Well, I think that there's, again, when microfinance is small, a pilot, as it was for many years in the United States until Grameen America came on the scene and really has, Grameen America will lend $1 billion in inner cities in the U.S. this year, in amounts averaging like $2,500. But when microfinance gets big, regulation becomes important. I'm no expert on that, but I will say that certain countries have done a really good job. I always think of, for years, there was the 3 Ps, Peru, Pakistan, and the Philippines. They're models to look for if countries want to do that. But I think the main thing is for governments not to mess it up, not to, in some attempt to, Nicaragua comes to mind with the No Pago movement and so forth. When governments see to score some, quick political points by bashing microfinance, they risk undoing decades of work and undoing, if you can avoid that, I think you're going to do okay. If you want to do the most enlightened microfinance regulation, and there are some countries, well-known countries, even better.
Yeah, microfinance needs to be regulated, but it needs to be regulated as microfinance. Not, there are some African countries, I'm not going to name names, that are grappling with this right now, but the regulations that they've introduced are somewhat more akin to banking regulations, right? And you can't you can't or shouldn't regulate the opening of a new microfinance branch the way you would the opening of a commercial bank branch. And so that's the nuance that I think a lot of governments are going to be grappling with in the next few years.
Great. So I'm going to move on to some questions from the audience. I just have one about Magdalena Brigasi asks about green finance and indicators that can be applied for microfinance. If BRAC or Grameen have any experience with green finance?
Yeah. So, I remember in the early 90s, I was staring outside the window of a second story of a bank branch, and there was this like huge solar panel in the courtyard, and it was like not working. Like it was basically like a failed experiment and I'm like, boy, I wonder if that's ever going to go anywhere. And what Grameen did ultimately, in terms of is develop a world-class kind of solar energy and renewable energy company called Grameen Shakti. And it's had its ups and downs over the years, but just done, is a world model in and of itself, apart from any connection to Grameen. And I think that's what Muhammad Yunus and insight he had when he wanted to start experimenting with things. And I think BRAC did something similar, but in a different way. He said, let's not, if we're going to pilot things, rather than do it under the Grameen Bank umbrella, where if they get big and if they have problems, it'll endanger Grameen. Let's create them as separate, independent legal entities. And some will fail, some will succeed, but and they'll have their own leadership, their own governance. And again, Grameen Shakti is one of the, if that's all they did in terms of in terms of kind of promoting renewable and green approach. It'd be incredible. There are other smaller things, but I think, not trying to integrate everything into what Grameen Bank does, which is not a bank, but is still a financial institution of a certain type. And other things, let it go on, but let it go on in kind of sister concerns. Seems to have served Grameen well.
Anything on BRAC that you'd like to add, Scott?
No, I would say that, there is a lot of interest in collateralized lending, and in many cases that Michael Kramer, for instance, from University of Chicago, is doing a series of studies on the effectiveness of collateralized lending. BRAC has experimented with that with solar panels in the past. Ran into some trouble I wouldn't say trouble, that's a strong word, but the administrative hassles of dealing with this is something we're still trying to work out. But I think there's a lot of promise for that in green energy solutions.
Great. So I'm just going to keep reading the questions as they're coming. Jeff Ash of Grassroots Finance Action is asking, how can Grameen and BRAC keep the microfinance movement on track to reaching the poorest?
Scott?
Well, I think it has to do with the convergence of these ultra poor graduation solutions that I've spoken of, and the availability of credit, right? Credit is and remains an essential tool for people empowering themselves to rise from poverty. It's not the only tool, but it remains an essential tool. As far as for researchers that say, microfinance, doesn't have a demonstrated impact on poverty, I would say, that's kind of like asking why didn't this hammer build a house? Well, try building a house without a hammer. It's very difficult, right? I would say that the convergence of graduation and the sort of wraparound. I haven't really given the pitch about graduation, but it's essentially it's a tailored and deliberately sequenced series of interventions that is targeted towards people who are at a level of destitution that is generally too severe to benefit from microfinance alone. And yet and we've taken this program to scale in Bangladesh, and it's been replicated in about 50 countries. What we find is that with the right services, and this includes the socio-emotional support that is needed, that boost of hope that Shohida got, with her goats, with the right sequence and right level of services, you can actually bring people to the bottom rung of the economic ladder, and they can continue to rise from poverty through taking loans. And what we find is that lending, that continuum between a state of ultra poverty where lending is not appropriate, and that state of moderate poverty where it is appropriate, that distinction is getting fuzzier and fuzzier, and we are seeing more of a continuum. And I think that is how we make sure that microfinance and the availability of credit and savings, right, remain relevant, not just to the poor, but to the very poorest as
well. Let me just say, first of all, I think that as we drive towards the Millennium Development Goal of essentially eliminating extreme poverty, we're going to need lots of different approaches.
Sustainable development goal.
Sustainable. Yeah. Anyway, sorry if I misspoke, but we're going to need a lot of approaches within microfinance. We're going to need a lot of approaches outside of microfinance. And, Jeff has been doing a fantastic job dating from his days in Oxfam America and now with Grassroots Finance Action to this kind of strain of the microfinance movement of savings-led, community-led. I think it's a very important part of the complete solution. And I commend him, and I encourage all of you to learn more about what he's doing and others who are in that part of the movement. In terms of Grameen, I think, again, it's very easy to sit in places like Washington and London and Geneva and to say microfinance doesn't work for the poorest, and let's just write them off as. But the reality is a lot different, right? And I think Scott has articulated really well that microfinance and variations on it that at the extreme end are the graduation model of BRAC that has been popularized around the world, or the struggling borrowers program of Grameen. It's a continuum. And the question is, can we develop differentiated services for people who are impacted by poverty in different ways? And I think both Grameen and BRAC have done really well there. I think there's a lot more to learn, because it's, and just to go to, a kind of a related question that, I think if Scott was going to ask me if we'd gone in that direction, poverty, for those of you, is, think about this, that earning less than $1 a day is not the big problem. The problem is if you're earning 75 cents a day, it varies a lot. And where microfinance comes in its various forms is that it gives liquidity. It gives a reliable source of capital, loans, and accessing your own savings. And that does a lot of things. But one of the things it does is it relieves the tension and anxiety that is a big part of an underappreciated part of poverty. I don't know about you, but when I'm anxious about things, I make bad decisions. And I think that's true of people of any socioeconomic class. And when you can just say, listen, if I hit a crisis, I can get a loan or I can access savings, that kind of gets people, it brings out the best in people in all dimensions. And I think that's one of the gifts of microfinance. Different methodologies address that differently. But I think it's a kind of a common thread. And also developing a social network. That was one of the things I saw in the rural Bangladesh, and when other places I visited less frequently, is that just, poverty is also very isolating. And when you kind of break that isolation, and there are many ways to do it, you start to play to people's strengths. They start to operate with more confidence, or as Scott might say, more hope, and a plan. And that can make all the difference in the world. You're muted again.
Sorry, thanks. I'm not sure if Scott, I think we've lost him. Hopefully he can come back on. But in the meantime, here you go.
No, he's gone.
Well, let's hope that he will be able to return. I mean, we are almost at the top of the hour anyway. I'd asked our guests, both Alex and Scott, to stay a few minutes over if there are more questions coming in. So maybe I can read a couple more questions, or I'm not sure, we had planned for each one of you to ask a question to each other. If you want to do that first, and then maybe I can read a couple more questions from the audience, and then we can close. Does that sound good? Shall we go? Maybe Scott, do you have a question for Alex? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, the call dropped and I rejoined on mute. My question for Alex is, I have years of I have about 10 years of experience. I'm calling from Bangladesh right now. I've never lived in Bangladesh. Alex lived in Bangladesh, and he lived in Bangladesh during what historically, according to my reading, is one of the crucial decades, which is the 1990s. You look at this sort of trajectory of Bangladesh, and you drop some of these statistics earlier, Valdetta. That was the decade where it really went from being, the so-called basket case in the famous words of Henry Kissinger, State Department official, to being a paragon of development, or at least a very positive model for development done right. And you could point out the different historical factors that led to that, but Alex was there and tells the stories not just of Professor Yunus, but of many of the women on the front lines of that transformation. And so my question for Alex is, viscerally, what did you see as a witness to that change? What was it about Bangladesh in the 1990s that really drove that historically unprecedented rate of change in people's lives?
It was an amazing time, it was an amazing experience. There's certain things, if you're ever going to do them in your life, you do them in your 20s. And that was, I spent 6 of those years in Bangladesh. And it was an amazing experience in so many ways. I think that, living out there in these communities for sometimes months at a time, it just revealed to me all sorts of layers. And it was amazing. In this one place I write about a lot in my book, in the first edition of my book, I've added some new material in the last 2 editions, but I almost never use the word I just wrote the book as if like a fly on the wall, when these borrowers in this one village in Bangladesh, another group of borrowers in urban Chicago, and then a fly on the wall in Muhammad Yunus trying to kind of grow the institution and the movement. And so I think, because I didn't want my story to become what the book was about. I want to be their stories. And I as I mentioned ago, I started to realize again that liquidity, that reliable source of capital, and how it impacts people's mental health, very big. But also, one of the things I saw is, and research later kind of backed this up, is how much Grameen and BRAC influence people who never borrow from it or never are direct beneficiaries. So many times sitting around a tea stall in rural Bangladesh, I would hear people say, without any prompting from me, I can't hire people to work in my field for the rate I used to, because so many of the families are doing their Grameen and BRAC activities, self-employment, or I can't hire people to work in my household as a servant. I have to pay them more because of that. And so the labor pool effect of allowing people to engage in self-employment with more capital really did have impacts on people who weren't direct beneficiaries, because again, it changed the market dynamic, and also changed in another way socially. All these borrower repayment meetings, which again, armchair critics of microfinance say, oh my God, these women hate coming to these meetings, and can we do away with the meetings? And the women loved to be able to, it was the 1 hour a week where the husband was responsible for childcare, and they got to come and it's like, it's like going to Starbucks, with your girlfriends, and yes, you pay off your loan and whatever. And they love that. And you say, to want to do away with that, I think doesn't really, now you want to make that more efficient, more value added. Absolutely. And just to see the kind of the social capital being developed at those meetings, and then what people feel like they have permission to do, as poor people, as women, as religious and ethnic minorities in their communities, because they're seeing it, and they're not as isolated from other families by virtue of their participation. And then others who just watch this process from afar, aren't part of Grameen or BRAC, but see what BRAC and Grameen women are doing, and they said, why can't I do that? I don't even need BRAC or Grameen. I'm just going to do it. So these were some of the things that, again, as the months went on, I saw, did I see dark sides of Grameen and dark sides of other organizations that all have? Of course I did. And fortunately, Grameen as a learning institution, had dealt with those as best it could. But I saw, the layers of impact, of influence, of changing cultural kind of norms, of giving people the sense of confidence that they could access finance when they needed it, just like you and I can use our credit cards or borrow or whatever when we need to. Those are all easy to miss, but the longer you're there, they're hard to ignore.
Great. Well, now the microphone again back to you, Alex, if you have a question for Scott.
I do. Abed was incredible. I'm a huge fan. I just, thinking about it, was as someone who kind of wrote his biography, did you have a sense that there was any achievement he had that made him most proud? And in general, like presenting him with your manuscript at the very, very end of his life, as I understand you did, what was that like to someone who accomplished so much, to play that role of the communicator, and also a very humble and modest man who didn't like to toot his own horn. You did that, and I think he got to see maybe not the final book, but at least the manuscript in his final days. What was that like? You're on mute.
Scott, your microphone is muted. Oh, I think we lost him again.
Well, that's one question I can't answer for him.
Wait, because he might be coming back up.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
not, I can go to a question for you, maybe, Alex, and then hopefully Scott can join back on. So there's a question from Isido Mushwana from South Africa. And she's asking, how have BRAC and Grameen Bank dealt with the aftermath of COVID? Have they experienced challenges in repayments, growth numbers, attrition, clients, and attrition rate? I can see now Scott is back, and so we might, if you don't mind, maybe we go back to Scott to answer his question, just in case he drops off again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, great! I wasn't even aware that I had dropped. It was because I heard everything. Abed saw that the capstone of his life's achievement, of a lifetime of achievement, was the establishment of BRAC University, because he really he believed that universities were kind of the institutions that last, and he had a whole speech about that. So that's the short answer to your first question. What was it like? I mean, we didn't really go into this, but yeah, he died in December 2019 after a short, he was told he had 4 months to live. And of course, I'd been dragging my feet in this book. And when he told me, he said, how about that book? Can you finish it? And I was like, okay, yeah, I guess I have to. Nothing like a deadline. He literally said to me, I would like to read it on my deathbed. And that is what he did. He didn't see the finished, the last few chapters hadn't been done, but about 80, 90% of what you see, he actually read and occasionally commented on. Although the comments were fairly sparse, but I do know that they were there. I knew that it was read to him. His eyesight was not, his reading ability had failed at the end of his life, so people had to read it to him. And I saw those comments in the margins, and I know that he read it. Probably the saddest, greatest disappointment, really, of my life is that he did not get to see hold the finished book. And here's the other thing that I just realized, a little while ago when I started thinking about the title. I couldn't remember when I came up with that title. And I had to search my inbox for the first mention of Hope Over Fate. And it was April or May of 2020. It was actually after he died. And so that genuinely makes me sad. He was never able to see the book, or now it just seems like that's what the book was always going to be called. But it wasn't until it was done that I finally nailed that title. So yeah, what was it like? Emotional, and yeah, I can't. I have feelings about it now. Put it that way.
Well, very well said. I think we're 10 minutes after the hour, and I had read a question to Alex when you cut off Scott. So while you're reflecting, maybe Alex can go back and try to answer the question from Isido Mushwana. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that well. And then we can wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Sure. I'll simply say this. First of all, I've not been back to Bangladesh since COVID, so I'm probably not the best person to ask about how Grameen has dealt with it in detail. But let me say a few things. There are others who can speak to that. First of all, Grameen Foundation that I started and that I ran for 18 years has been very active in assisting communities, microfinance institutions, other civil society organizations deal with the pandemic, deal with in refugee issues. I'm very pleased that the leadership of Grameen Foundation, since I left in late 2015, has taken the organization to new levels, and I encourage people to check it out and support it and see how to collaborate. In terms of Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, I assume that they just took out their playbook from having dealt with all these other disasters, floods and cyclones and you name it, and it was a well-honed approach. And I think the organization is continuing to do very well, continue to generate profits, continuing to track social progress within its borrowers. But let me just finally say, Grameen America, that was started in 2008 as a sister organization of Grameen Foundation, has done extremely well, and they dealt with COVID. Within a week, they converted all of their borrower, what we call center meetings in Grameen, into virtual meetings by Zoom. And basically, the organization during the COVID gave out, like several 100,000 loans, of which, as of when I went to press with this book, exactly one of those loans was overdue. One. And actually, they're never going back to in-person meetings now that COVID is more or less over. It was an innovation that is going to continue within that model. So, in my book, which we haven't really talked about much, I was curious to how Grameen could be applied in the U.S. And frankly, I thought it would help me sell more books when the first edition came out. So I went and researched the early use of microfinance in urban U.S. And you could see the glimmer of possibility, but it wasn't really yet realized. And I wrote about some borrowers who did pretty well, but had their ups and downs in South Chicago. And again, Grameen America has taken all of those glimmers of hope and turned it into a massive success that is very exciting. Again, it was all hands on deck for the pandemic. Grameen Bank, Grameen Foundation, Grameen America, we all did our part, and other, networks such as BRAC, such as, international humanitarian groups. And somehow we seem to have all pulled through it as best we can. And now, trying to, build back better and reach these, sustainable development goals, which are still out there. And I still think, we have potential to reach them.
Thank you. Scott, anything to add on your side? I think maybe you might have not heard the question, but the question was how BRAC and Grameen dealt with the aftermath of COVID, and if they experienced any challenges, especially in the growth of clients and attrition rates.
No, but microfinance is doing very well post-COVID. I would say that, and this is, this is only building on a very good and comprehensive answer that Alice gave. I think it's probably pushed us a little bit to experiment more with remote and hybrid solutions, not just in microfinance, but in various ways. That big question of when digital finance, if and when digital finance really takes hold, what becomes of the group meeting? Is there something that can approximate that sort of that level of social capital building that takes place at the group finance meeting that could perhaps be mediated through technology? I don't know. I don't think we really know yet. So for an institution that was really built on people talking to people, when people couldn't talk to people or had to stand 6 feet away or couldn't travel, that was obviously challenging, and it forced us to innovate as challenges often do. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. That said, the microfinance, both lending and savings programs are going very strong, and I think that yeah, there's more of a push to at least experiment with, if not digital solutions or remote solutions, hybrid solutions. And what that looks like, I think we still have a few more years before we really land on that.
Great. Well, I had promised that we will go up to 15 minutes over time, and I think just to you know, being conscious of everybody else's time here. I see that we still have over 60 people sticking in, which is great. Just wanted to say thank you again for you know, sharing these stories, sharing your books and your insights. I think I really got inspired a lot, and I enjoyed reading both books. As you can see, I have them both here with a lot of stickers around. So I really recommend them, highly recommend them. So we will send information in terms of how you can get them online, and you know, feel free to also post some links here on the chat if you have them ready. But we will definitely send links to the books through in an email to everybody who is registered. We'll post the recording on the FinDev Gateway website and also include links there for people to access the books. And yeah, if you have any final remarks you want to share, or final things you want to share, Alex, Scott, feel free to do so.
I do not, except to say that I'm as you can guess, I'm on my phone right now. The laptop connection was not
pretty
very
well.
Good. There's a website that I know about called Amazon.com, and you can search for Hope Over Fate there. You can also buy it directly from the publisher, and there are other various online venues. I'm not able to put the link in the chat right now, but I'll be sure to share it with you. So
are there audio versions?
We actually just signed a deal to do an audio book, and the question is whether I'm going to read it myself. I have the option of reading it myself, but that just seems like a lot of work. So yes, there will be an audio version, and I'll let you know when it comes out.
Yeah.
Great, please do.
Yeah, my West Coast friends tell me I'm nuts for not having a audio version, because they all consume books in cars as they sit in traffic, but I haven't yet.
I've gotten that a lot too. Yeah, I've gotten that a lot.
So anyway, I simply say this has been a pleasure to do, you know, with the Gateway, with BRAC. You know, I've written some other books about nonprofit leadership where I talk more about my learnings, but this book really isn't about me. This is a book about microfinance and the kind of Grameen spirit. You know, I hope people check it out. It's and it's, you know, my wife, who works in public health, as I said, she worked briefly in BRAC for a couple of years in the 90s. You know, she said, you know, microfinance was like, everyone was talking about it, and then in 2015 it seems to like have disappeared from the face of the earth, at least in the North America. Like, and then my wife, who's in public health, says it seems like it's coming back. Like, people are starting to talk about it again. So just like in fashion, you know, fads come and go, but Grameen and BRAC have been there throughout. And if the international development kind of you know, kind of intelligentsia wants to come back and look at microfinance and look at Grameen and BRAC as hard as they used to, and we welcome that, but the work will continue regardless. And it's been a pleasure to talk about it today.
Great. Well, likewise. And I think FinDev has had a long and a large microfinance audience, so throughout this time. So it never went away. But I'm glad that you could spare this time to talk to us, and hopefully we'll meet again in another setting and another panel or conversation, because there's so much to talk about on microfinance issues. And yeah, we'll just leave it at that. And thanks again to everyone who joined. We will follow up by an email before the end of the week. So thanks again. And thanks to Daniel.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Abby and Gaia for supporting the event throughout. So thanks.
Thank you.